Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. We're excited to bring this topic to you, and thank you for joining us. Our topic is practicing Agile accessibility in large organizations. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'm going to serve as your host and moderator for today's webinar. A few housekeeping items we want to take care of before we begin. First, we're recording the webinar, and we will provide both the recording and the slides to everyone that participates following the webinar. They'll be available on DevOps.com, as well as all participants will receive an email with a link to the slides and recording. Also, if you require captions, you can access that information via a link that we've posted into the webinar software. We love questions. Our speaker loves questions, and you'll find that as he gets into his content, is an expert in this field. So we'd love to have your questions. Please enter those into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar software. Last but not least, we have 3 Amazon gift cards that we're giving away at the conclusion of the webinar. So hang in there, find out who wins. Let's get right to our topic, practicing Agile accessibility in large organizations. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dylan Barrow, who's Chief Product Officer at DQ. Now, DQ is a leader in the accessibility space and has been doing this kind of work for over 20 years. A lot of experience bringing to the table. Dylan, I'm going to hand the baton over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Mitch. So imagine you're a traveler walking along the road, and all of a sudden, in front of you, out of the water, there pops up this beast, this fantastic beast, multi-headed, sharp teeth, and you're completely surprised. You weren't expecting this, and so you can't go back. So you decide, well, you're going to fight it, and you fight it, and you have what you think is a great success. You cut off its head, and all of a sudden there are 2 heads in place of where there was 1. Very frustrating experience. Not only frustrating, also in this particular case, probably pretty frightening experience. But this is an analogy to the experience that a lot of large organizations face when they start to deal with accessibility. They feel like it's this unexpected thing that just popped up out of nowhere, and that every time they try to deal with it, they think they've dealt with it, and then there's more to deal with. The reason for this is because these organizations don't really approach accessibility in the correct way. If you're working in a large organization today, you're probably doing Agile. And if you're doing Agile, if you were around at that particular time, you probably went through what was called an Agile transformation of some sort. So what I'm going to do to illustrate how accessibility should be done and how it shouldn't be done is I'm going to pretend we're doing an Agile transformation the way that most organizations, or a lot of organizations, try to do accessibility. Okay, so let's go. Our Agile transformation done like a lot of people do accessibility. Well, the first thing is one slide too. Let's go back. I've read books and I've read a lot of articles about the fact that if you want to be Agile, you need to have the right environment for your teams. There's a lot of aspects of this that are important. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in some architects and designers, and we're going to design a great creative space for our teams. We're going to have areas that support verbal communication. So we're going to co-locate everybody, all the different roles in the team. We're going to sit together. We're going to have cellular office arrangements so we can move things around easily, expand and contract as we need to, as the teams grow and change over time. We're going to have areas where different teams that have to work together can collaborate together in a multi-team environment. We're going to put up windows to the outside world, making the space nice and airy and fresh. And where there aren't any windows, we'll put up artificial windows and graphics. We'll create places where you can support collective mind, brainstorming. We'll have areas for socializing. We'll have areas for chilling out and possibly even taking naps. And we'll have areas for product owners and for meetings and for other sorts of activities as well. When we're designing these, of course, what we'll do is we'll create these graphics on the walls, and we'll put up a lot of buzzwords up there. Things like Agile, test-driven development, continuous integration. And the important thing about these words is that once we bring the developers in and we fill the spaces with all the teams, the developers will be able to look at the walls, and they'll be able to see these terms, and they'll be able to Google them and find out what they mean. And that's how they'll learn to do accessibility. The way that they learn most of the other technologies like React. They use Google, they use the internet, and they'll be successful. And once we've done that, we've brought everybody in, they're off to the races, and we'll go and play golf with our consulting buddies and think about what's the next great thing we can do to increase the productivity of our organization. Now, you may laugh at this and say, well, that's not realistic. Nobody would do an agile transformation like that. But really, when I talk to a lot of organizations, I go to a lot of conferences and I talk to a lot of people, and they'll come up to our booth and they'll say, oh, accessibility, that's great. We do accessibility. Every time I meet somebody who says they do accessibility, I'm really excited. I'm excited to learn how they're doing it, what they're doing, what their struggles are, because there's not that many people that are truly acting on accessibility. But often when I say, oh, that's great, what are you doing? When you do accessibility, what they'll say things like, well, we've made WCAG 2A and AA part of our requirements for our organization. I say, that's fantastic. You're going AA, that's excellent. That's a great standard. So these days, they may say 2.1, WCAG 2.1. And I'll say, so what else do you do? How do you get your teams to do that? And oftentimes I'll hear, well, we put into the done statement that it's got to comply with WCAG 2A and AA, and we link out to the standard on the W3C organization website, and there's a lot of information there that the teams can use. And then every now and then we'll bring in an outside consultant, and they'll do a VPAT for us, an assessment with a VPAT, and that's what we do. And that's really disappointing to me, because I know often if I take that organization and I go to their website and I just do a cursory analysis of it, I can see that they're failing. They're not doing very well. And the reason for that is that accessibility does involve actually quite a lot of change. It involves learning new skills. There are a lot of actually skills that are required in different roles throughout the organization in order to do accessibility well. 80% of accessibility is simple, but 20% of it is really hard. And 20% of the correct approach to accessibility can also solve 80% of your problems. So if you're doing it wrong, you're also wasting a lot of effort. The problem with change is that everybody wants change, but when you ask who wants to actually change, you don't get a lot of people putting up their hand for that. So if you don't manage that accessibility change within your organization, it's not going to happen. So what is the reason that you need to manage this? Why is it so? Isn't it like React and some of the other technologies that you can just tell your developers, go and learn about accessibility, and they can go out on the web and they can learn about it? Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that unlike React, where if you implement something and you run it, it either runs or it doesn't run, accessibility is a little bit more less cut and dried than that. So that is one aspect of it. There's also a lot of information out on the internet which is perhaps incorrect, which is not complete in terms of how it looks at accessibility, maybe addresses one disability type and not others, maybe addresses one operating system and not others. So the information is not as cut and dried and easy to evaluate as with standard technology topics. But the other possibly more important reason is that a lot of the people working on these development teams really don't have a lot of experience with people with disabilities. They're probably from relatively well-to-do families, certainly well-educated. They've educated themselves at the very least. Probably highly intelligent people, probably living in neighborhoods that are rather well off. And so they don't see a lot of people with disabilities. They don't know a lot of people with disabilities. If they do, probably one or two members of their family have some sort of issue. And those sorts of people tend to have a little bit more motivation than most to try to learn the topic, and once they become aware of it. But what's going on here is that most of these development team members are living in what I call an empathy bubble. They really just don't understand. And this is illustrated by kind of the type of conversation that I have at some of these conferences when somebody comes up to me and asks what I do, and I say I do accessibility, and they look at me with a blank stare. They don't know what that means, and I say, well, accessibility is about making your application usable by somebody with a disability. I get a blank stare, and so what I do is I pull up my cell phone, I turn on VoiceOver, and I show them how with VoiceOver you can get the screen reader to read out the application to you. And their eyes open up wide, and they're like, wow, did you write that software? And I say, no, I didn't write that software. Apple wrote that software. It's on your phone as well if you've got an Apple. If you've got an Android phone, there's something similar from Google. But no, I didn't write that software. What I do is I help companies to ensure that their applications can interface correctly with that sort of software so that people with all sorts of disabilities are able to use it. And the gears start going. There's like, okay, I can kind of see how with that software, somebody who's blind might be able to use the internet, which is, wow, that's crazy to me. I'd never thought of that. But what do I need to do in order to make my applications work well with that? And so you can see that that process has started of them starting to inquire as to what is this all about? What do I need to do to make this happen? And that's really when you've burst the empathy bubble, and now you've opened their eyes in a way that that is very difficult to do simply through telling people do X, do Y. Once they understand the impact that this has on people and what it really means to use a mobile phone or a computer with an assistive technology, they can start to think and incorporate that thinking into what they're doing and into their learning. So what you see here is a photo of an event that we hold. We do these for our customers. We also do them at accessibility meetups and the like. It's called an empathy lab. And what we do in an empathy lab is we set up a bunch of different stations, and at each station there's an activity that participants can participate in that teaches them some aspect of a disability, that gives them insight into what it's like to use a particular assistive technology or what it's like to have a particular type of disabilities. And what you can see here is my friend Chris McMeeking working with a participant here with a single switch device, which is very similar to what somebody like Stephen Hawking, who's wheelchair bound, maybe has mobility disabilities, would use to interface with a computer of some sort. And so we find this is a very good way of really getting your development team members to understand what it means to have a disability and to use these assistive technologies in the appropriate way. Another very, very powerful mechanism that you can use is usability testing. Now, later on, I'll talk a little bit about how usability testing isn't the only sort of testing that you need to do, but it's very important. It's a very powerful tool that you can use because there's nothing more powerful for a developer who's really invested a lot in their application. It's kind of like their baby. They've invested huge amounts in this application, a lot of their time, and for them to sit behind a glass window watching somebody try to use their software and struggling to use it is one of the most powerful motivators I've seen. So what we'll do is we'll bring people in with various different types of disabilities. We'll sit them down. We'll give them a task to complete or tasks to complete on a particular application, and we'll just observe where they struggle and the struggles that they have. And I've seen people from development teams come out of some of these sessions, walk straight back to their desks and start making changes immediately because it became really real to them about how these sorts of issues can affect people in terms of using the application in the way that it was intended. And when it comes to these sorts of events, they're not a one-off thing. You really need to think about a schedule of these events as an ongoing campaign that you do as part of your organization's transformation. So preparing these events, preparing the timing of them, perhaps coordinating that they coincide with other hackathons or other events that are going on where there are a lot of people in a creative mindset, and then scheduling them in such a way that people who can't attend some of the first events can then have an opportunity later on to attend, or if there are new people in your organization, there's opportunities for these new people to come and learn through these empathy events. And the whole idea behind the empathy campaign is really to create the motivation so that you don't have to go around arguing for accessibility, that the teams themselves have some motivation from within to make sure that their software and applications are accessible. So Roger Federer, arguably the best tennis player of all time. I'm a big tennis fan. Really watching the Cincinnati Western and Southern Open this week. Really interested to go down there this weekend and see some of the semifinals myself. But why does Roger Federer need a coach? Even if that coach is somebody as accomplished as Stefan Edberg, obviously in his own right a very good tennis player, why does Roger Federer need somebody like that? I don't know the exact reason that Roger Federer chooses to have a coach, but from my perspective, as somebody who also plays tennis, I know that when I'm trying to improve my game, the perspective that I have is from my first person point of view. It's through my lens. It's through the way that I look at the game and the way that I've always looked at the game and the things that I try to do to improve my game. A coach can come in and look at the game from a different perspective. And certainly somebody like Stefan Edberg, who's played at a very high level, may have techniques or training, whether those are training techniques or things that they do during the game that broaden the perspective of Roger Federer and give him other ideas that he can incorporate into his way of thinking. So that second perspective from the outside, from a different point of view, is instrumental in people like Roger Federer who want to stay at the top of the game, get better all the time, and stay there for as long as possible. And we recommend the same sort of approach both in terms of your transformation and on an ongoing basis for your teams as they're learning to do accessibility and as they're trying to excel at accessibility. We recommend getting a group of accessibility coaches and assigning them to the different teams. About three teams per coach is a great number, depending on the load and what those teams are actually working on at any given point in time. And what the coach does is the coach helps the team to adopt the skills and adopt the practices, to look for areas that need improvement and to help them with that improvement. So that might be organizing specific trainings. It may be organizing information on particular skills that they need. It may be helping them with how to use the tools more appropriately. It may be just helping them brainstorm about ways that they can improve their process to better incorporate these practices and techniques into their day-to-day workflows. So one of the most important things that the coach does is set some milestones. What is an achievable milestone that the team can aim for that'll get them closer to 100% accessibility? Because going from 0 to 100 is almost impossible immediately. You need to set achievable milestones that will get you there, where you can celebrate success, or where you can celebrate, or where you can shoot for trying to overachieve a goal that you set for yourself. A great milestone, an example of that is, okay, let's forget about all the legacy code we have, but let's make sure that all new code that we create by the end of this period in time is going to be clean in terms of the accessibility issues we can detect with automated accessibility testing before we merge the code. That's a great milestone. If you can hit that milestone with all your new UI code, you've already improved your process to an amazing degree. So let's set that milestone, let's shoot for that, and when we get there, we'll set our next milestone for improvement. Helping the team then to create a dashboard to measure progress towards those milestones is important. Performing spot checks on some of the new work and pointing out areas for improvement where things may have been missed, where the techniques may have been used incorrectly, and trying to identify areas for better training. Attending sprint retrospectives and helping the team talk through and evaluate themselves in terms of accessibility are some of the things that the accessibility coach can do. So I've mentioned a couple of these practices, and these are what I call organizational transformation practices. They're practices that need to be controlled from a central point, and you should really create a team, a central accessibility team, whose goal and whose aim it is to actually run this transformation practice. Now, I've seen in Agile transformations the same sort of thing. You set up a team. The team's aim is to manage the transformation, and at the end of that, the team often goes away. From an accessibility point of view, there is a long-term role that this team should play. This team is going to continue to monitor changes in accessibility legislation, changes in accessibility technologies, new user interface technologies are coming out, and the team needs to stay on top of those and make sure the organization understands them, understands how to make accessible applications on top of those technologies, etc. So this team has an ongoing role as well. But the team in the transformation will be responsible for executing the empathy program to drive motivation, make sure that there are high quality learning resources available to the teams, and integrating these learning resources and courses into onboarding for new employees, forming and managing the team of accessibility coaches, and creating an accessibility dashboard for the entire organization to measure the progress towards this agile transformation. Okay, so all software development really begins with design. And if you've been doing user interface or user experience design for some period of time, you're probably using personas in your design thinking. And personas are a great tool that can be used in heuristic thinking about the design to try to anticipate problems, to try to anticipate needs, and to try to design then the solutions that the software is going to provide to serve those needs and to overcome those problems. And what you'll notice if you look at this here, this is Lucy. She has some goals that are pretty normal. Figure out what her ideal steps per day goal should be for her fitness tracker. This is a fitness tracker application. But you'll also notice that on the bottom right here, she has what we call a particularity. And in this case, Lucy was born blind and relies on screen readers and haptic and audio feedback. So that's what's unique about her. But otherwise, she's just a normal persona. And when we first started out with these personas, we would design these personas which were a person with a disability. And we found that bloated up the number of personas. And so what we do now is we integrate a particularity into existing personas, and that makes it much easier to think about these disabilities as part of your normal design thinking. And so in this case, Lucy has a frustration. When she wants to see her tracker, she has to use the app, which is obviously a big burden to using a fitness tracker. You have to carry your phone around with you. That can be a burden. And so that's the challenge for the design team, is to find a way for the fitness tracker to convey that same information through haptic means to Lucy. When we talk about accessibility in design, we often talk about accessibility being a design, a usability lens. And what I mean by usability lens is it focuses on usability problems that are not just usability problems for people with a disability. And the way that it does this is by exposing functionality that's very difficult to make accessible. It often exposes functionality that's way too complex or is actually quite off the mark in terms of trying to achieve what that application is trying to achieve. A good example of this is maps. So when maps first came out, whether you talk about MapQuest or Google Maps or whatever, it all of a sudden became extremely easy to put a map on a web application. Whereas before that, it was very, very difficult to do that. And because it was easy, people would do it. They would say, okay, let's put a map here, regardless of what problem they were trying to solve. And a good example of this is when the University of Ottawa was, not the university, the city of Ottawa was deciding on whether or not to expand the boundaries of the city. They went to an application designer. They said, design an application that will help the voters decide whether or not to do this. And of course, the natural thing was to put a map there. And then they brought in an accessibility consultant and said, how do we make this accessible? And the accessibility consultant was like, this is extremely difficult to make accessible in all the richness that you have with a map. So let's go out and let's ask the users what sort of questions they want to answer through this application so that we can then figure out what parts of the map we need to make accessible. And the end result of that is that they can boil down to one problem that everyone wanted solved. They wanted to know whether a given address was inside or outside the proposed boundary of the city. So the solution to that was not to make that information visible through the map. The solution to that was actually to design a simple interface where you enter an address and it told you that this will be inside or outside the new or existing boundary of the city. And what that ended up doing is making that application much more usable for everyone, not just for people with disabilities, but at the same time, it became an application that was very, very easy to make accessible because it was a simple form and a simple search result and nothing else. Once you've done your design and you've come up with something that you think you can make accessible, there's a lot of information in the designer's head, a lot of thinking that's been going on. And a lot of designers don't communicate all of that information to the design teams, the development teams. And as a result, the development teams have to actually invent some of that themselves in ways that end up making the application inaccessible. what we teach organizations is to teach their designers what information really needs to be communicated that's already in their head. And then we teach the designers about the little bit of additional thinking that they need to do as designers to make sure that they've covered all aspects of accessibility from their design. And and then most importantly, how to communicate this to the development teams. Now, what I'm going to show you here is a design comp annotation. And some of you will say, well, that's not how we do designs. We do designs on whiteboards, and it's all very dynamic, and it's all done in real time as part of the team. That's great. I'm not advocating that you start doing things on paper. What I'm advocating is the communication, and this communication can be done in person. It can be done on a whiteboard as well as through any other means. What you see here in front of you is a very simple toolbar, and the toolbar has 3 buttons. It has a button with an arrow and a vertical line facing left. It has a play pause button, and it has a arrow and a vertical line pointing to the right. And most of you will recognize what those buttons mean. It's previous track, play pause, next track. But let's see the type of annotation that you should be doing with this simple mock-up, such that that information is conveyed to the developers and can then also become part of what gets tested during your testing through automation, so that you can actually make the testing efficient and repeatable and automated. So the first type of annotation that you should do, or the first type of information that you need to convey to the developers, is what are these things? What is the role of each of the elements in the design? In this case, we've got a toolbar that consists of 3 buttons, and each of those is in fact a button. There's the role of that first one is button. The name is previous track, and the state is disabled. So we're communicating role, name, state, and value, if there were a value of this element. And all of this is really important, because what we've also now communicated to the developer is what the accessible name of that image button should be if it gets implemented ultimately as an image button. The name is previous track, and the developer doesn't have to invent something, and they won't forget it. And the tester can take that, and they can make sure that there's a unit test or a test of some sort that's going to validate that that button has an accessible name of previous track. So none of this information is forgotten. None of the information has to be made up by the developers themselves. And there's enough information there for the testers to actually test it without necessarily being accessibility experts at all. So the second type of annotation that we're going to do is the interaction annotations. Now, for the touch, that might be obvious, and in most cases it is, right? What happens, when you click the play pause button with your fingers, probably pretty obvious. But how do you interact with this in terms of using a keyboard? What happens when you tab into that toolbar? Where does the focus go? Does it go to that first previous track button, even though it's disabled, or does it go to the play pause button? What happens if I press tab? Does that go to the next button, or do you use the arrow keys to navigate between these buttons? Now, in a lot of cases, there are best practices for this. There are ARIA authoring practices that you can just point to. But in some instances, there aren't. And so in those instances where there aren't, you need to specify that sort of stuff. The third type of annotation, or the third type of information that you need to communicate, is all the different states. So I talked about this disabled state of that button, the previous track button, but there's also the focus state of the play pause button, for example, in the bottom. And so what I've done here is I've said the focus state for the buttons is using a different color scheme, and the foreground and background colors are there. And if I'm a designer that's worth their chops, I've done the color contrast calculations on those to make sure that they're all good. And then the fourth thing is sizing, and sizing on different screens, as well as on, say the primary screen size that might be anticipated for the user. So in this case, I'm saying the touch size, target size for the button should be at least 56 by 56, and that will ensure that somebody who has maybe a little bit of a shaky hand can also interact with that button. So now you've done your design, you've communicated your design, your developers have gone off and developed it, and now you're at that part of the development cycle, which is often viewed in the same way that Sisyphus is viewed. Somebody pushing a stone up to the top of the mountain only to see it roll down to the bottom of the mountain again. And that part is what is the accessibility testing. And the reason that accessibility testing is viewed as a sort of Sisyphus type work is that often organizations regard accessibility testing as something that has to be manual and that has to involve users. So just like Sisyphus is a myth, I want to introduce you to two myths related to accessibility testing. The first myth is that accessibility testing cannot be automated. It can, and I'll show you how to do that today. The second is that accessibility testing is usability testing. It's not. There are two aspects to accessibility, and usability, like I told you earlier on, is extremely important. Usability testing with people with disabilities, extremely valuable and extremely important. But there is something called technical accessibility. And technical accessibility boils down to three things. Is the user interface element or content perceivable to the person given the senses that they have? So can I detect the meaning of this image on the bottom right over here, the stick in the mud, which is often the impression that accessibility testing has within the development lifecycle. If I cannot perceive that with my senses, then there's an accessibility problem. Can I operate the user interface controls? And can I understand the information that's being conveyed to me? Perceivable, operable, understandable. And all of these things don't require usability testing to test. The understanding piece comes straight out of the designs. The designers communicate their intent. They communicate the information that needs to be conveyed. And you can, in a very black and white way, you can test whether things are perceivable or operable. So there's different types of automated testing. I'm a little bit biased here. Obviously, ACTS is DQ's automated testing open source library. But there are alternatives to this. So the first thing we recommend is get yourself a really good automated accessibility testing library. And this can serve as a test-driven development test suite of accessibility tests. ACTS, for example, runs about 60 different tests automatically against your user interface and will tell you exactly what's wrong with it. And we'll do it in a way where we guarantee zero false positives. This is important because this means that developers can rely on this. They know they can integrate this library into their functional testing, and whenever it raises an issue, they can be certain that's something that has to be fixed. So we have a mantra, and our mantra is no code merges until ACTS clean. If you can get there, it'll find 50% of your accessibility issues by volume, and you're already halfway to solving your problem. The part that ACTS and tools like it cannot solve on their own is the part related to meaning. And I alluded a little bit earlier to where that meaning comes from. This image that you're seeing here, I ran it through some of the artificial intelligence alternative text generation tools that are out there on the internet, and I got some really interesting results. One of them was person in a crowd on a cell phone, talking on a cell phone. And obviously there's no cell phone in here, but even if that were correct, what is not being conveyed or is not being detected by these artificial intelligence algorithms, and where we still cannot expect automation to really fill the gap, is in the meaning. This is not just an average person. This is Ilhan Omar, who is a representative in the US House of Representatives that's standing in the middle of this image. And the people in the crowd that she's standing in are not just normal people. They're the people that she represents. They're her constituents. So that sort of meaning is something that cannot be automated. But that doesn't mean it cannot be automatically tested. It can. The meaning in a lot of these instances comes from the designers. So when the designers design the user interface element and they put an icon into that user interface element, they should provide the description of that icon and that conveys the meaning that they're trying to convey through the design. And then a tester can take that meaning and they can build it into an automated test. So let's look at first at some of that design communication I was talking about earlier, the interaction with the keyboard. How do we test that automatically? Well, this is an example of some code that does that. This is testing a horizontal menu bar. And when you focus that menu bar in the leftmost element in the menu bar and you press the left key, the focus is supposed to cycle around to the rightmost element in the menu bar. And that's exactly what's being tested here. We're simulating the key down with the left key, and then we're making sure that the browser's focus went to the correct element in the menu. And so from now on, as the developer was developing this, they obviously tested this using the keyboard. And but now, from this point on, they don't have to. Nobody has to test this with the keyboard. It can be tested automatically as part of the regression suite. Moving on to some of the things that are more related to meaning. If you go to the DQ website, you'll find a logo in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, as is pretty usual for most websites. And there's an alt attribute on that says DQ logo. So by simply adding 2 lines of text to a test suite somewhere, we can catch most of the errors related to that and make sure that text alternative stays there, and that text alternative is associated with the correct image. The first thing we do is we make sure that the image that we're talking about is in fact logo.png. So if somebody goes into the website and changes that to dylan.png, this test will break because now they may have decided to put my image at the top left of the page. That may be a great decision, but the DQ logo is no longer the correct alt attribute for that image. So when somebody changes the image, we need to go change the test. And then the second thing is, if somebody goes and changes the alt attribute, the test will break, and we'll have to make sure that the new alt attribute actually does match the image. And if you're using Axe Core, there are some utility functions that you can use to help you with this, because there's many different ways that you can provide an alt attribute for an image. The alt attribute itself is one, but by utilizing these utility functions, you can actually allow the developers to choose the appropriate way of providing the alt attribute, and your test can remain the same and can pass regardless of the implementation mechanism. So I've talked about a couple of what we call the team practices. There are 2 team practices on here that I haven't talked about in detail. I just want to mention them quickly. One is accessibility defect management. This is very important, because if you do this the correct way, your organization as a whole can treat accessibility defects in very similar ways to the way you treat other defects like security or functional defects, and you can know which sort of defects are the ones that need to stop a release versus which ones could be fixed later on. So it's the correct management of accessibility defects is important from that perspective. And the second advantage you can get from this is that if you're doing this in the correct way and you have the correct metadata in your defect tracking system, you can generate a VPAT directly out of your defect tracking system. The second one is a pattern library. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits that you can get if you have an accessible pattern library that's used across many of your applications. One of our customers is a large financial services organization, and when they were going through a big remediation project, they found that because they'd used the same component library across many of their applications, by going in and doing these fixes in this component library, they were able to remediate thousands of defects across dozens of various different applications with very little effort. So this can work in both ways. It can work both in terms of remediation, but also in terms of new application development. If you make the components reusable and reuse them once they've been made accessible, that makes the amount of work that the teams have to do in terms of accessible development reduces that quite a lot. And with that, so that's it. Thank you for your attention. I'd like to see whether there are any questions.
Oh, we've got a lot of questions for you here. You've really sparked some interest in this topic. Appreciate it, Dylan. First question is, what's a good business case for addressing accessibility in the production phase versus post-production? I suppose building in accessibility versus adding it.
Yeah, so this is what we call shifting accessibility left. And the business case for this is not very dissimilar from the case for any defect, catching any defect early. Companies like IBM have published studies on the cost of finding and fixing a defect that made it to production versus finding that defect during the development process. And the differences are 2 orders of magnitude, or 100 to 1. And we even find that if you do the design phase well, and you include accessibility thinking into your design phase, you can actually eliminate 70% of your defects altogether just by communicating the correct information from your designers to your developers. So the savings are immense, as high as 100 to 1.
Excellent. Next question is, what kind of resources are available for teams to learn more about accessibility?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of information out on the internet which is not accurate, as I mentioned earlier, but there are quite a lot of both free and commercial sources out there. Of course, I have to mention DQ's dquniversity.com. We have a lot of free resources on that. We have a lot of courses. If you're looking to do IAAP certification, for example, we have courses that can help you with that. But there are also very reputable sources out there, like the WebAIM website, and they also have a mailing list. And then the Accessibility Slack is another great resource if you want some real-time questions answered.
Well, you really burst my bubble with that comment about everything's not accurate on the internet. I'm going to have to give that some thought there, Dylan. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Can you explain some ways that you can use Axe? What are the different ways you can use it?
Yeah, Axe is actually a collection of tools. The easiest way to get started with Axe is just to download the extension. We have an extension for Chrome and an extension for Firefox, and just use that browser extension to analyze the application that you're working on, or the application that's in production. That's the easiest way to get started with it. But then we have a lot of different APIs that start with a JavaScript API, which you can use to embed in any framework that is web-based, for web-based testing. And we have a lot of different bindings to things like Selenium, WebDriver IO, WebDriver.js, Cypress IO. We have JavaScript, we have Java, and we have Ruby bindings in Axe. And then Axe consists of the basic analysis API that I talked about earlier, as well as some utility functions that you can use to calculate things like accessible name, calculate whether or not something is accessible to a screen reader or visible to a screen reader, etc.
Okay, great. Sounds pretty comprehensive there. How about desktop and mobile applications? Do each need separate code for accessibility?
I think the answer to this question is yes. There's different. If you're implementing applications and you're implementing something on a desktop or in the web, and you're implementing something for native accessibility, then the techniques that you're going to use for that are very different. So obviously, HTML-based applications use HTML, which is a markup language, and the techniques that you use to make that accessible are going to be very different from, say, a Swift-based native application running on iOS. So yes, they're very different in terms of what you have to do and the techniques you have to use, as well as if you're trying to run automated testing against that, you want to have rule sets that are designed to fit those particular platforms. So, for example, in Axe, we have the Axe core, which is HTML-based, and we also have Axe Android, which evaluates the Android application from a native Android perspective, which is very different from the HTML accessibility perspective.
Wonderful. We have another question about screen readers, that sometimes they can navigate content differently. For example, between JAWS and NVDA for Windows, VoiceOver for OS X, Chromevox, etc. But there can be navigation bugs in that as well. The real question they're asking is, how many do you have to support to really provide enough accessibility, versus trying to go overboard, support too many things and make your life too complex?
Yeah, if you're testing all those different platforms, then you're definitely in best practice territory, because that's certainly more than we would expect most organizations to do. So it really depends on the perspective that you're coming at this from. If you're coming at this from the perspective of a controlled intranet environment where you're creating applications for your employees, and you pretty much know exactly what operating system they have and what assistive technologies you make available to them, then all you need to do is make sure that the application works in that environment. Whereas if you're trying to create an application that's for the general public, then you need to take into account what's available for the general public. And if you're interested in staying, say, WCAG compliant, there's a part of WCAG called accessibility supported that you should pay attention to here. And what that basically says, if you boil it down, is make sure that your application works with assistive technologies that are freely and widely available. And so when we counsel our customers, the minimum that we tell them to do is to make sure that they test with NVDA. And the reason for that is that NVDA is very standards-based. It's very strict. It sticks to the standards, doesn't try to do anything other than that. And so you can be certain that if something works there, it's highly likely that it'll work on all the other platforms. But the reverse is not true. If something works on one of the other commercial screen readers, they may be actually guessing. They may be trying to associate information. Some of them do some very complicated things to try to make up for the deficiencies in applications. So if something works in one of those screen readers, you cannot guarantee that it will work in others. So NVDA is definitely a staple that we recommend everybody test. And then beyond that, you can go a little bit further if you wanted to test some of the native mobile stuff we might suggest testing on certain native mobile screen readers. Certainly if you have a native mobile app, we would require you to test the screen reader that comes with that native mobile platform. So TalkBack on Android or VoiceOver on iOS.
Great. Next question is, how do you integrate accessibility testing into an existing test process?
Yeah, this is actually a more complicated question than it may seem on the surface. And to a large degree, it depends on two things: the maturity of the team that we're talking about. Does the team have a lot of automated accessibility, not automated accessibility, does the team have a lot of automated testing at all, functional testing or not? And then the second thing it depends a lot on is how much time and effort do they have to invest in retrofitting that sort of testing to test for accessibility. It's obviously a lot easier if you're creating an application from scratch. Our recommendation is pretty simple. Automate as much of your functional testing as you can, or as makes sense for the number of times that you're going to release software, and then integrate accessibility into that right from the beginning. That's the recommendation for new software. But for legacy applications, we've seen customers adopt things from utilizing the browser extensions I talked about earlier and doing some manual testing every now and again on the one hand. And on the other extreme, taking their existing functional testing suites and building accessibility into that after the fact. And then there are some techniques you can use which are somewhere in between, where you can utilize the automation to write some accessibility-specific automation, or we also have something we call a robot, which you can, through scripting, simple scripting, you can create some automation that can test your existing applications in an automated fashion.
Excellent. The next question is about preventing regression of fixes and errors that have been corrected in software. Is there anything unique about accessibility and ways that you can prevent bugs and fixes from going away or being introduced back into software?
No, I don't think there is, actually. I think accessibility from that perspective is just like anything else. An accessibility defect is a defect. It needs to be treated like a defect. Some of those are going to be blocker level defects and some aren't. And from a regression perspective, if you fixed a problem, you should be writing a unit or an integration test that validates that. And then that becomes part of your regression. And so if you're running those regressions, every time you test your software, then you should pick that up very early in your development process and be able to fix it. So no, our recommendation is you should treat accessibility quality just like you treat anything else.
Yeah, if we could solve that problem, we have a lot fewer bugs in our software. Right?
Yeah, I'm not saying that's an easy problem. I'm just saying it's no different.
Yeah, just no different. Well, that makes sense too. How about the Axe API testing part of? Is it part of the free subscription, or do you have to pay to get that feature?
No, the API is free and open source as part of Axe Core. Yeah, so that's completely freely available.
Okay. Next question is, do you have any example of common gray areas in accessibility testing or implementation, and how did you proceed? What they're talking specifically about is about elements in WCAG that are a little bit unclear or leave room for interpretation.
Yeah, this is somewhat unfortunate is that unlike some aspects of software development, there is, even though the WCAG is quite clearly specified, there's still a lot of bad interpretations of WCAG. And certainly when WCAG is new, for example, we've just had WCAG 2.1 come out, it takes a while for everybody to really understand what that means. And so our approach, yeah, there definitely are gray areas. Some of those gray areas have to do with this screen reader supports this, that screen reader doesn't support this, and so that accessibility supported is one aspect which people struggle with a little bit. Understanding how to interpret that, but it's a solvable problem. And then the other one is real interpretation differences. So one example recently was WCAG 2.1 came out with color contrast requirements for buttons and for icons, and there was a lot of discussion around does that apply to the border of that button or not, and we went back and forth with that. And DQ, we actually have a council of people whose responsibility is to look at those problems, to go and look at the standards, to work with the WCAG working group, and to come to a resolution. And that's how we deal with that, is we go through that process internally.
Great. WCAG. Now I know how to pronounce that. Thank you. When it comes to coaching, how have you approached large organizations that have hundreds of developers when you only have maybe a handful of SMEs expert in accessibility?
Yeah, that is a difficult problem. The first thing to do is to impress upon your organization some of the things that I've been talking about transformation, about the importance of coaches, and also about how doing things properly from the beginning is going to drive down your costs on the one hand. On the other hand, I think just the business case of the opportunity around 20% of the population, and what the organization can stand to gain if you address that percentage of the population is one thing to do to help with that. But at the end of the day, if you only have a certain number of resources and those number of resources isn't enough, then my recommendation would be to just prioritize the most important applications and the most important workflows within those applications, so that at least the stuff that has the biggest impact on your user base and on your business is going to be covered. So I would really prioritize from that perspective if you don't have as many resources as you'd like to have.
Good. We got just a couple more questions. The next one is, do you have any tips for how to recruit people with disabilities for usability testing?
Yes, I do. There are organizations which specialize in this. Nobility is one example of an organization that specializes in this. And what they will do is they will go and recruit those users for you and make it very easy for you to get them included in your usability testing. DQ ourselves, we do that. It's not something that we don't focus only on that, but it's something that we also do, so we can help you with that as well.
Great. The last question is a trick question introduced by me, your moderator. Since you're a tennis fan, Roger Federer versus Rafael Nadal. What does it take for Federer to beat Nadal like he did in July of this year?
What it takes is to not be on a clay court,
yes,
for example.
Certainly an advantage.
Yeah, and other than that, it's 50-50. They're both great players. So.
They are two great competitors. I love watching them both, and many others. Well, we've exhausted our questions, so they've been fantastic questions. Thank you very much, Daryl, for answering those. And I want to thank also our audience, our participants, for offering those questions. So we'd like to now take just a brief minute to introduce or announce our winners of the $50 Amazon gift card. Congratulations go to the following three people: Carlin S., Dover C., and William L. We'll be in contact with you to get hold of those gift cards. Also want to remind about our webinar recording will be available after the webinar, as well as the slides at devops.com and via an email that you'll receive. And remember to check out the devops.com site for some excellent webinars that are coming up. Well, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our speaker today, Dylan Barrow, who's Chief Product Officer of DQ. Dylan, thank you so much for speaking today.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch. It's been a pleasure.
You know, I also want to thank you for not only creating a more accessible software, but inclusive software. I think it's important work that you're doing. So thank you for doing that. And we'd like to thank you, our audience, for joining our webinar today, and thank you for your valuable time. It's been my pleasure to host your webinar. Have a great day. Be careful out there.